Throughout history, royal families have sought to maintain their power, wealth, and status through all manner of schemes and acts. However, some royal families engaged in a disturbing practice to achieve these aims: inbreeding. This led to disastrous consequences, such as congenital illnesses and the decline of many a once great house. In today's video, we will explore the most infamous cases of inbreeding in royal families, the impact it had on the individuals involved, and its disturbing legacy. Inbreeding happens when closely related people have children. This increases the chance of passing two copies of the same recessive gene, which can lead to genetic disorders. Scientists measure inbreeding in something called the inbreeding coefficient, which ranges from 0, which is no inbreeding, to 1, completely inbred. For example, if someone's parents are first cousins, their inbreeding coefficient is 0.0625, meaning there is a 6.25% chance of inheriting the same gene from both sides. Whilst in the case of siblings or parent-child offspring, the inbreeding coefficient is 0.25, a 25% chance of inheriting two copies of the same gene. By inheriting two of the same gene, there is an increased chance of the recessive conditions being present in the child. Now with this cleared up, let's have a look at some of the most inbred monarchs in history. We will start with arguably the most infamous examples of royal inbreeding, the Habsburgs. They were once one of the most powerful royal families in Europe. The Habsburg royal family held the throne of the Holy Roman Empire from 1438 until 1740. By the 16th century, the family held lands in Spain, the Netherlands, France, Italy, Austria, and in the Balkans. The Habsburgs were notorious for marrying within their own family to maintain political power and control over their lands. It was not uncommon for an uncle to marry a niece, or for first cousins to marry. This can perhaps be best seen, if somewhat confusingly, in the Habsburg family tree, though the term tree is a bit generous. As the practice carried on for generations, the genetic similarities only became more and more pronounced. As a result, the Habsburgs' bloodline became so inbred that it led to a genetic condition known as the Habsburg jaw. This was the most visible consequence of the Habsburgs' inbreeding, and became more and more pronounced as the family continued to inbreed. This pronounced and protruding lower jaw was not just a cosmetic issue. The Habsburg jaw made it difficult for individuals to chew or even speak properly, leading to further complications and pain. Perhaps the most notable member of the Habsburg royal family was King Charles II of Spain. He had an inbreeding coefficient of 0.25, yet his mother and father were not brother and sister. Rather, they were uncle and niece, a sign that his parents were also themselves heavily inbred. He was by all accounts severely disabled, and he also had the infamous Habsburg jaw along with a large tongue. It was said that Charles was unable to speak until he was 4 years old, and he swallowed his food whole. As a child, he contracted a number of illnesses, including measles, rubella, and smallpox. It's also speculated that he could have suffered with hormone deficiency and kidney failure. He struggled to walk, to write, and he suffered with depression. He earned the nickname Charles the Hexed on account of his many conditions and illnesses. He was also likely impotent, never producing an heir. This in turn led to conflict on his death as to who would inherit his lands. His autopsy described him in rather unkind terms, stating, quote, "His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his intestines were rotten and gangrenous. He had a single testicle as black as coal, and his head was full of water." Yet, for all of his detractors, he was noted for his kindness towards foreign dignitaries and for his love of the outdoors. Charles was the worst affected by his family's inbreeding, but he was far from alone. Don Carlos of Spain, the eldest son of King Philip II of Spain and his second wife, Queen Maria of Portugal, is another tragic example. Don Carlos of Spain was born in 1545 to parents that were cousins, who were themselves the product of inbreeding. This set the stage for the genetic issues that would plague Carlos. In a disturbing example of how closely related his parents were, Carlos only had 4 great-grandparents, rather than the typical 8. He inherited a range of physical and mental health problems. Carlos had shoulders at different heights, and a pronounced limp due to differently sized legs, leading to difficulty walking. He also showed signs of mental instability, including violent outbursts against staff and animals. In some particularly disturbing examples, Carlos had one of his members of staff eat excrement and would take pleasure in riding his horses far too hard until they collapsed with exhaustion and died. In 1562, Carlos suffered a head injury which was eventually treated with trepanation. This is a surgery where a hole is drilled into the skull, or parts of the skull are removed to relieve pressure. After this injury, his outbursts only worsened. It is therefore perhaps not too surprising that Carlos was denied opportunities and positions in authority by his father. His arranged marriages too were postponed, only fueling Carlos's rage and the rift with his father. Don Carlos became even more disturbed. He once allegedly tried to burn a person alive and even injured himself to manipulate others. He hated his father, King Philip II, but his resentment was fiercest towards John of Austria, his popular, half-illegitimate brother. John of Austria was popular, successful, and favoured by the king. Carlos became ever more paranoid and believed that John and King Philip were conspiring against him. And so Carlos secretly plotted to flee to the Netherlands, where a rebellion against Spanish rule was beginning to brew. He hoped to gain power by siding with the rebels. However, Carlos approached John of Austria, asking him for support to escape. But instead, John told King Philip II everything, and this betrayal enraged Carlos. Soon after, Don Carlos attempted to shoot John, but the weapon had been unloaded beforehand. He then attacked him physically with his bare hands. However, John was able to survive. And with this, King Philip II personally ordered the arrest of Don Carlos, his own son. He was confined in a secure room, and access to him was tightly controlled. All sharp objects, glass, and anything potentially harmful were removed from his room. Even food was delivered under strict conditions. There were rumours that he was tortured, and that he grew ever more mad during his imprisonment. During his imprisonment, he refused food, and became increasingly thin. Over 6 months, Carlos wasted away, and in July of 1568, Don Carlos was dead at the age of 23. Some say he was poisoned, some say that he starved himself to death, but the modern consensus is that he died from natural causes. The next example of inbred royalty is Ferdinand of Austria. He was born in 1793 to parents who were double cousins. Double cousins are children of siblings who marry siblings, meaning they share both sets of grandparents and are related through both parents, essentially being cousins on both sides. Ferdinand was related to the Habsburgs, which accounts for some of the inbreeding problems. As a result, he was born with an inbreeding coefficient of 17%, bringing with it all manner of health complications. Ferdinand was born with hydrocephalus, a condition in which brain fluid builds up within the brain. This leads to problems as pressure builds up in the skull. In Ferdinand's case, he had a deformed skull, suffered with epilepsy, and had a speech impediment. Ferdinand struggled in his childhood. His conditions were not understood, nor was he encouraged or stimulated in any way to develop. As a result, he was incapable of pouring himself a glass of water, opening a door, or even climbing stairs without help. Despite all of this being said, Ferdinand was noted for keeping a daily journal of his activities and thoughts, and was noted for his sharp and witty remarks. He is said to have been a talented artist, and had a keen interest in both nature and scientific advancements, all whilst being able to speak 5 languages. Sadly, he would reportedly suffer with as many as 20 seizures a day, heavily limiting how effectively he could rule. And so he acted as Emperor of Austria in name only. The day-to-day running of Austria was left to other people. In 1831, Ferdinand was married to Maria Anna of Piedmont, Sardinia, and she was herself a distant relative. The two never had any children, with Ferdinand unable to consummate the marriage due to numerous seizures. Maria often referred to herself not as Ferdinand's wife, but as his nurse. In 1848, a series of revolutions in Austria abolished the absolute monarchy that Ferdinand had represented. He abdicated and spent the rest of his life in Czechoslovakia, residing in the Prague castle. Retirement seemed to suit Ferdinand very well. He wandered the Bohemian streets and handed out sweets and money to children and beggars. Rather than being a tyrannical king deposed by an angry population, he earned the nickname Ferdinand the Benign. It was the councillors and the regents who ruled on his behalf who were blamed for the problems that caused the revolution in the first place. Ferdinand died on the 29th of June 1885, at the age of 82. The final example will be that of Maria I of Portugal, sometimes known as Maria the Mad. She was born on the 17th of December 1734 to the House of Braganza. The royal lineage of the House of Braganza had 14 monarchs ruled Portugal and several inbred marriages. The family was descended from the Habsburgs, bringing with it the lack of genetic variation, but the house continued to marry relative to relative. There were examples of second cousin marriages, first cousin marriages, and an uncle and niece marriage. It was Maria I who would marry her uncle, Pedro III, her father's younger brother. This was due to Maria being the only surviving child to her father, King Dom Joseph I. Of her 8 siblings, 4 were stillborn, likely due to the generations of inbreeding. As Maria was to be the first female monarch of Portugal, she was married to her uncle to solidify her claim and maintain the rule within her family. Maria showed signs of mental health problems in her teenage years, when suffering with bouts of melancholy and nervous agitation, but a series of unfortunate events only compounded these issues. In 1755, Maria witnessed the destruction of Lisbon to an earthquake, a tsunami, and fires. The earthquake struck on All Saints' Day, when the churches were packed, contributing to tens of thousands being killed. The royal family managed to survive, but Maria doubled down on her religious devotion as to avoid a repeat of the same tragedy. Maria would then marry her uncle in 1760, when she was 25 and he was 42. Despite the age gap and familial ties, the marriage was by all accounts a happy one. The pair had 7 children, but only 3 survived to adulthood, again likely due to inbreeding. In 1777, Maria ascended to the Portuguese throne, with her husband being regent. Her first 9 years were marked as peaceful, setting about rebuilding Lisbon and overseeing the construction of as many cultural and religious buildings. Closer relations with Spain were also built, with Maria marrying her daughter and son to the Spanish royal family. The King of Spain at the time was Carlos III and was Maria's uncle, meaning cousins were marrying cousins. What's more, these cousins were themselves the products of inbreeding, compounding these genetic problems. For example, the Spanish princess Carlota was betrothed to marry Maria's grandson. She had the infamous Habsburg jaw. As has been a theme of this video so far, these unions often resulted in many more miscarriages, stillbirths, and high rates of infant mortality. But as Maria grew older, she came to be afflicted more and more by delirium. The first sign came in 1786, when during a routine state function, Maria began screaming that she was burning in hell. Her mental decline was made all the worse by the deaths of her husband, eldest son, daughter, and infant grandson. All of these deaths occurred in quick succession. The children had all died from smallpox, and Maria blamed herself as she had refused to inoculate them from the disease. Maria would spend much of her time praying and screaming, believing herself damned and already living in hell. She banned all music and entertainment at court, transforming the court into a Catholic mass. As her mental health worsened, she was subjected to all manner of treatments that at the time were considered pioneering, but are now quite disturbing. She was diagnosed with melancholia and religious mania. She was treated with ice baths, enemas, and confinement, often bound in straitjackets. One visitor to the court recalls hearing the non-stop screaming as follows: "I heard the most agonizing shrieks, that inflicted on me the sensation of horror such as I had never felt before. As a result, Maria was relieved of her duties as queen in 1792, spending much of her time isolated away. During the Napoleonic Wars and the French invasion of Portugal, Maria and her family fled to their colony of Brazil. Although, because of this, Maria became terrified that she was being kidnapped. She screamed all the way to the docks. In Brazil, she earned the nickname Maria the Mad, as she spent much of her time terrified of the locals. Maria would spend her last years in a convent, cared for by nuns. There she would remain until her death in 1816, blighted by mental illness likely caused by or made worse by the inbreeding. These examples are just a few of the more disturbing cases of royal inbreeding and the devastating consequences it had on the individuals affected. The desire to maintain power over a kingdom led to a truly disturbing practice that ought to be a grim, if somewhat unnecessary, reminder as to the dangers of inbreeding.